Hi, Professor Xavia here. This week, I thought I'd take a minute and tell you a little bit about writing up your work. So you finished your project, you're back from the field, you've analyzed all the wonderful data you've collected, and now it's time to either write a book, write your paper, or an article for popular press to share all this wonderful things that you have learned and documented. So this really is how you bring your work into the broader conversation, either social conversation about the issue and or the academic research conversation. So this is where you bring everything together so that someone can read your paper, read your essay, and have a similar experience, or the best experience you can portray. So as you go about writing your paper, your goal should be to provide an ethical representation of your data. So you should be using clear communication. Don't use too many jargons unless it's an academic paper and it's appropriate to use specific terminology. But always think about explaining any specialized terms that you are going to use. One of my advisors always told me you should write for the educated audience. So that means not just people in my discipline. So I think that's a really good rule of thumb. So ditch the jargon and try to explain things so that the average intelligent person can understand. So as you think about getting ready to write up your project, I urge you to remember one of the most important things about writing is that it takes time. And it takes a lot of time because you need time to think, you need time to write, and you specifically need time to edit. And that last one is what a lot of early writers forget, that you can spend almost as much time polishing as you do writing your first draft sometimes, because you do want it to be as well written and as compelling as possible. So it's very important to carve out enough time to do justice to the data that you'll be representing. So depending on the outlet that you're hoping to publish your work in, you'll notice that there are very specific formats and rules for each outlet, shall we say. So if you were going to write an article for popular press, a journalistic piece, you would probably spend less of your time with the literature review, and the methods would be reduced considerably. You still have to tell people what you did and how you came to know what you're telling them that you now know. But other than that, it should have some of the similar components to an academic piece of writing. So for the rest of this video, what I'll do is talk a little bit about how to construct an academic journal article. What's the format? What are the components that need to be included? And let's see, can I hold this without glare? There we go. So for more information, if you're just fascinated and want to know more detail, chapter 10 of this text, I'll link it below, is a more in-depth conversation about writing, but I highly recommend. It's a good resource for you. Okay, what are the basic components of an academic journal article? So of course, first there will be a title and your byline, if you will, then an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, methods, then your analysis, your findings and results, which you kind of started to draft when you were analyzing your data, putting it all together, and then your conclusions, and of course your reference section. Don't forget that. You need to have all of the work that you've cited properly identified in the text and then listed fully in the reference section. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So how to begin? Beginning is often the hardest. So you're looking at this blank page on your screen. Where do you start? I always advise people to start with their methods section, and the same time you begin, be sure you are also putting together your reference section. So as you cite an article or refer to something, make sure you also go ahead and put it in your reference file, because things get lost and forgotten along the way. And if you don't do it as you go, you might spend a lot of time looking through Google Scholar to try and find out what the full citation is for that little reference that you forgot where you got it. So, two kind of ideas on how to start. So methods and your reference section. So your methods section should include a description of what you did, where and how and why, all of those sorts of things. But specifically, you should have a thick description of your setting or a strong overview of your sample to give people an idea of where this is all coming from. You should also talk about any data collection procedures. So did you do an ethnography? Were you in the field observing for so many months? Did you snowball to find your sample, your interviewees? All of that should be included in your methods section. Additionally, you'll want to add how you chose to analyze the data. Did you use the tenets of qualitative analysis? Did you use grounded theory? Did you use something else? So this is what you would put in your methods section. So the next thing you'll move on to writing will be your introduction and your literature review. You want your introduction to have that grab effect. You want readers to read the first 2 sentences and say, oh yes, I definitely want to read the rest of this article. So try to put something as compelling as possible up front in your interview section. Tell readers why the work that you did is important and why they want to follow through and read the rest of the article. Now your literature review should be a finely crafted argument, in a sense. So you'll be talking about the literature in the field that's relevant to your project, how your findings are going to agree or disagree. You'll want to hint at that. And you should make sure that you put an overview of any controversies in the field. One person thinks this and the other person thinks that, and where your work will fit in the middle of that. You'll also want to kind of craft this conversation, shall we say, of the literature review that's relevant so that it kind of comes to it culminates with the idea that your project is the next logical step. So you're creating an argument that says your work is important and of value to this broader academic conversation. And then you'll finally end with your statement of your research goals, your research questions, or your focus, whichever frame you're planning to use for this article. So after you've drafted the introduction and the literature review, you can move on to incorporating your findings. So at this, and results, findings and results. So at this point, you will provide an overview of your data. What are the themes that arose from this project? What are the sub-themes? How do they interrelate? So your analysis is presented and then you illustrate it with quotes from your data. So that could be quotes from your field notes or quotes from interviews, whichever is appropriate for the point that you're making. So it's a general rule of thumb that you should provide at least 3 examples of each theme. So this can be quotes from your interviews, quotes from your field notes, observations that you've documented photographically if you want to put some images in. But basically 3 is a good number. It's not hard and fast, and it depends on a lot of things, but just as a general rule, if you're starting out, you should think about having 3 separate examples of each of the themes that you want to introduce as representative of your data. Next, you'll write the conclusion. The summary, revisit the themes that you introduced in your introduction and your lit review. What were the relevant themes that came out of the literature that you provided? What insights were gained from your research project, how you have been able to add or extend what has been known in the past. The conclusion is also where you would mention any policy implications that may have arisen from your findings that would be advisable to move forward. You also here will mention any future research that you think needs to be done at this point. So your work has led to this, and what's the next logical step after your work? So that's your conclusion in a nutshell, but you're not done. So now you start the editing process. And it's at this point that I suggest you go back and look at your introduction and your lit review and make sure that the argument that you set out at the beginning of the paper matches the summary and conclusions you have at the end of the paper. So compare your lit review and make sure it matches your conclusions. And that's where you start to smooth the paper over and make sure that all the components come together. You'll want to reread it, read the whole paper 2 or 3 times. You might even want to ask a colleague or a friend to read it to see if it makes sense to them. It's always best to find the errors or oversights before it's published, so it's always good to get some feedback before you move forward or send it to a journal for review. So editing, make sure it's smoothed over. Once you have the general draft of the article in the format that you like, you've edited it, it's smoothed out, you still have 2 more steps. So now is the time to write the abstract. And the abstract is often the most challenging part of writing the paper. You won't think so because every phase has been challenging, but it's hard to kind of put everything into 200 or 250 words. Now, the abstract should tell the reader why it's important, as well as listing the focus of your work, what were your research questions, if you had research questions, what was your approach? Were you doing a theoretical investigation or a substantive field work? What was your approach? And then your methods. I interviewed X number of women from 18 to 22, or I spent 4 months participant observation in a specific community. Whatever it is, methods have to be there, and your analysis process. Any key findings. So it's not a mystery novel. You have to put the answers to the questions right up there in the abstract so that people know if it's relevant for them. So, and then after the key findings, you can add anything that relates to policy implementations if that's relevant for your project. So 200 to 250 words. Good luck. Okay, so editing, you might still want to smooth it over or you'll get feedback from your friends. But once it's edited, once you have your abstract and a title, try to come up with a compelling title that's also illustrative of the data. So often people will find a really compelling quote, something somebody said in the field that really is evocative, and that will be the beginning of the title. Then you'll have a colon, and then you'll mention field work in an urban setting. That's too vague, but you would come up with something that's more descriptive of your project. And there's some examples all over. All you have to do is pull open a journal, and if it's a boring title and you don't follow that example, if it sounds intriguing, use that example for how to construct your title. Okay, so now you have everything from title to references. You have all the components and you are ready to send it off to your publisher, your academic journal. They often will send it out for review. And if they do send it out for review, you'll usually get comments from 2 or 3 other academics that are knowledgeable in the field so that they can give you feedback. And the journal editor will then either say, no, I don't think this is ready for us or a fit for our journal, or he'll say, if you'll address this, this, and this, then we'd like to have it back to consider publishing it. So revise and resubmit is what that's called. So that's writing a qualitative academic journal article in a nutshell. I hope this is helpful. I hope it gives you kind of a game plan of how to go about writing one that won't make you too crazy. Starting is always the hardest, which is why methods, you've already done that, you know that is a great place to start. So good luck, have fun, and I look forward to reading what wonderful articles you put together. We'll be part of the broader conversation. All right, take care, bye.